monster. And where does it lead? Let the girl tell this story.
It was a hell of a dream that Frank had that night. A dream that started a chain of events harder to control than a $10 whore with an empty stomach. The way it started, Frank and his brother Hank had gone to bed early, but Frank woke up screaming sometime before midnight. It was December 26th, and neither one of them had gotten what they wanted for Christmas. They decided to go out. They wandered around for a while and ended up at a dive called the Exit Bar. Some nights you go out, everybody looks like an animal. They tried to chat up some bunnies, but they were too dumb. So they headed back out onto the street. This is where me and my roommate Cherry come in. I was hanging out on Main Street. I'm a working girl. Cherry decided she wanted to try it. She was real straight, worked in a bank, but she had an adventurous streak. Pretty soon, up walked these two guys, brothers, no doubt about it, that pathetic Frank and his brother Hank. Frank, whose first mistake was falling hook, line, and sinker for yours truly. In his eyes, I was the girl of his dreams. The boys flashed some cash, so we went over to their house. There were no fireworks with me and Frank, especially with my boyfriend Rat outside the window. He was always sniffing around my business. Cherry was a little nervous at first, but once Hank started rocking, she got into it. Way into it. Poor Cherry. I didn't think too much of Frank. And anyway, I wasn't doing it for the fireworks, but next door it sounded hot and heavy. Frank kept giving me funny looks, and he asked me to spend the night. I wanted to know how much money he had, and he told me he was broke. That was my cue to head downstairs, where Rat was waiting outside. Rat told me to go home. He wanted to stick around, said he had some business to take care of. I didn't know what time Cherry got in, and I had no idea what my boyfriend was up to all night. Cherry was making a hell of a racket in the kitchen, banging pots around and crying. Seems she had really flipped over this Hank guy, went all goo-goo on him, and he thought she was just a hooker. He couldn't understand, and he kicked her out, and that made her feel all dirty and creepy. I told her the worst thing a whore could do was confuse business with love. At that point, Rat showed up. He started pumping Cherry about her job at the bank. I told her to ignore him. He was always up to something. But he wouldn't back off. I could tell he was cooking up a no-good scheme. He was awful nervous. Just then the sun came up, and Cherry had to get ready for her day job. Meanwhile, Frank's brother Hank had forgotten about Cherry. He didn't give her a second thought. But Frank was all worked up over me. He'd fallen for me, fallen hard. He told his brother he was desperate for money because that was the only way he could have me. Hank couldn't believe it. Frank was letting a two-bit hooker get under his skin. Then Frank flipped. He started tearing the place up, looking for cash. His brother thought it was a big joke. He told him, "If you're so desperate, why don't you go knock over an old lady?" Even when Frank went for the gun, Hank didn't get it. He didn't know that Frank had a plan. Cherry went to work as usual that morning, even without any sleep and screwing and crying all night. I told you she was a straight girl. Nothing much going on at the bank. Business as usual. A few old birds making deposits. All of a sudden, Frank appeared at the door with a mask over his face and the gun pointed right at Cherry. Everybody screamed and hit the floor. It was a stick-up. But Cherry wasn't fooled by the disguise. She recognized him by his hands, or thought she did. She thought Frank was Hank. She was ready to do anything. She handed over the dough and begged Frank to take her with him. But Frank was just trying to get out of there before all hell broke loose. Some wacko teller wasn't part of his plan. Back at the house, Hank started to get a bad vibe about his brother. He tried to relax. He lay down to take a nap, and it turned into a nightmare. Hank woke up real agitated. He was worried sick about Frank. He thought about the gun, about his brother wanting money, and the 2 chicks from the night before. Something told him to go look for his brother at the bank. That was around the time I found out about the deal the Rat had going with Frank. I'm thinking we're going out to breakfast when Rat informs me we're heading to the scene of a crime. Seems he told Frank a price he could have me for, and he put him up to robbing the bank. Rat said he'd supply the getaway car, but he really had other plans. He was going to snatch the cash and leave Frank in the dust. He didn't count on Cherry being in the way, or the brakes failing on that old jalopy. The Rat's not around anymore. I fingered him for setting up Frank, and he got 20 years. I haven't heard from Hank since the trial, and I want to keep it that way. He just goes on, blaming himself for what happened. Frank and Cherry are paying for their mistakes in a box 6 feet under. Me, I moved uptown, got myself a new setup. A sugar daddy who gives me plenty of cash and lots of time to spend it. He knows that love's not a part of the deal, never was in my business. That's a lesson I learned a long time ago.